Dan, hey, congratulations for your documentary, Geoff McFetridge, Drawing a Life.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and it's a wonderful documentary. But I also want to congratulate that it's being showcased at South by Southwest. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I mean, it's kind of it's crazy, you know. Like we had a short there, I think in 2014 or so. So to come back all these years later, it feels great, and it's just like a dream to have a premiere at such a major festival, and to be able to share it with audiences and see the reaction. And Jeff's going to come out, and it's going to be a great experience. So we're really excited.
That is terrific. So tell us, what sparked you to do this documentary in the first place?
Yeah, I was initially drawn to Jeff's art. I've been a fan of, I studied graphic design in the early 2000s, and he was kind of this pinnacle of graphic design at that point. He hadn't really started making a ton of art. So I've been tracking along his career and kind of saw him get into art, saw him take art more seriously, saw the amazing work he's done on the design side. So I was drawn in. I've been a fan of his work for a while, and was able to meet him in 2015 and make a short together. And then in 2019, we were contract or 18, we were contracted to make another short about him, and he doesn't need another short film. And I was like, maybe we could do something bigger. And so I was originally drawn in by the art and my connection to him as a person, but then I think the way the film really took shape is when I learned more about him as a man and how he approaches life, and being able to kind of level up to these larger life questions that we all have. But then using his art and his artistic approach as a conduit to this larger kind of story about leading a fulfilling life.
Tell me about this short film that you initially did with Geoff. What was that one about?
Yeah, my friend owned a gallery and they were having a show, and I wanted to kind of like talk about how he saw these little moments in life and turned them into pieces of art. And it was a short 3-minute thing that we made together. We spent a day together. I got to interview him for a couple hours, and we filmed him walking around the gallery. And I thought we had a really good connection. And then at the end of that day, he opened up in the last shot and like performed in this very funny, unexplored way that I hadn't really tapped into the rest of the day. And I was like, oh man, there's something more to this dude than I'd seen in the 10 plus hours that we'd spend. So I was like, there was always a little kernel in me that there was another side to him that he hadn't totally shown publicly. And when this opportunity came up to tell this larger story, I kind of really kind of pushed in and was like, let's use this as a little test run of like making a feature film by spending 4 or 5 days together to see if we kind of click and can kind of make something bigger.
Most excellent. So it didn't take much convincing to convince Geoff to participate in this documentary, then.
It actually did.
Oh.
As much as, yeah. So he was down to shoot. He never said, yes, I want to make a film. So it was like this weird thing where like I kept asking him to come back and shoot, and he never said no. And we never were like, we're making a movie. It was just like we just kept coming back to film more. And in fact, sometimes he was going on trips and he didn't want me to come. And I had to really kind of like fight. He's like, it's this like weird middle ground where he's like a pretty well-known guy. He's got a lot of things going on. This is not the most interesting thing that's happening in his life. So it was this slow process of me building trust with him. And then I think like 3 years in, we showed him a cut of the film. And then I think he really got it, what we were trying to do. And things unlocked like a whole nother way. But he was never like, yes, I'll sign on the dotted line and we'll make a documentary. It was much more like organic and flowing than that. It happened a long process of building trust and of him opening up to me kind of emotionally and personally, which took a bit of time to get there.
Did it also take a little bit of time to get his family involvement into the process too?
For sure. Like his wife, she didn't want to be in it in the initial cuts because she felt like it should be more about him. And we kind of like, the more I befriended her and had a dialogue with Geoff, and I felt like there was this missing link if she wasn't as featured, if we didn't interview her. And the children, we wanted to include them, but not have them be on camera being interviewed. I wanted to allude to it. I wanted to show their personalities and show how much Geoff loved them, but I didn't feel like it was necessary to really kind of feature them as characters. So, but I didn't go to Geoff's house until like year 4, and it was like literally the last shoot. It was the first time I went in his house. It was like, it was this slow process of him. He has a very public life, but then he also had this extreme private side. And in the past, he's been interviewed countless times, but he always lets people in to a point. And I think it was this huge trust exercise of like slowly him understanding what we were doing and him feeling comfortable to open up to me emotionally, to let his family be involved, who he's super protective of. It was kind of this process of kind of like opening up and really telling this larger story.
Wow, that's wonderful. It only took 2 films and many years to gain his trust. So how did you want to craft this story? I believe that's probably the hardest thing to do, is trying to find the story to tell with Geoff.
Yeah, and it started with just a sheer fascination with his art. And I thought that there was going to be this facade of him as this positive family guy, and there was going to be this dark image of like this swashbuckling, like Jackson Pollock, alcoholic rage artist behind that facade. And there was a public facade that he was hiding something. The more I got to know him, I realized it was the opposite. And like there was this layer of positivity in a quest for positivity and personal groundedness, which is why his art is what it is. So when we unlocked that, I was like, oh, there's a much bigger story here. But then mechanically, how do you tell that in an arc of a film? Because there isn't like giant drama in our film. Like it's not that type of movie. There isn't like some giant goal he's trying to attain. It's this much subtler construction. So it took a lot of back and forth and massaging to kind of figure out what that arc was. Like all these little struggles and battles along the way that lead to a very different place than when he started. But it isn't this like giant arc. It's pretty subtle. And I think I love films like that. I kind of am not super into those like very gimmicky 3 characters and like see who wins the battle. Like that's just not, I'm like much more of a cerebral person. And I think Geoff is for sure that cerebral person. And I think a lot of documentaries is like listening to the film and the film that needs to become. So I had certainly had ideas of where I thought the film would go, but really just being open to that process of understanding who Geoff is and the best way to kind of like tell his story was the majority of the 4-year process. It's kind of like thinking through those things over and over and over.
Especially the fact that he's an artist who found success while he's alive, not after he died. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this interesting thing. He's very successful, but he's not like Jeff Koons or like these like giant art, so he's really successful, but there's also like a lot of room for him to grow. So like I kind of like felt like I caught him at this amazing time where he was turning 50, he was looking back, but I think he still got 40, 50 years ahead of him to like define a legacy. So I felt like I caught him at this perfect point where he wasn't this emerging artist and he wasn't like showing at the MoMA, but he is pretty successful.
Now, when you are writing this story of him, the narration, was that his words, or did you have to write those words for him?
They're his words. He writes poetry throughout his sketchbooks, and we kind of like unearthed those and found those. And I had him read some of those out loud, and that was a way to kind of like get into these subjects, but in a much more abstract, poetic way. And in earlier cuts of the film, we like really made that clear. Like, I am a man who writes poetry, but I really dialed back because Geoff has a sense of mystery. So I liked kind of not over describing that and like letting people guess where these words are coming from. Like, and it was a way to talk about things like biography in a way that was like a little bit more poetic because they are poems. And it made, you could spend, it's like 30, 25 minutes of the movie where we're talking about these biographical facts of his childhood, etc. The poems were a great way to break up, and even like the chapter poems were a great way to kind of like break this thing and be like, there's some other stuff happening here that's not super clear. We want to vaguely get you there and give you a feeling, because Geoff, his life is about all these feelings that are like pretty abstract and poetic, and I wanted to package all of them together, and that was like a great through line, these poems, in order to do that.
Wow. I mean, it does show a different side of him, and that's what you aim to do.
He's an enigma of ever-ending possibility and different sides. So like the moment I felt like I figured him out, there I would find these poems or find drawings I'd never seen before, or find a project or a relationship I'd never heard of. It's like it was constantly changing. I think that's what keeps it interesting, but it was also, it was pretty intense to like the moment we thought we cracked it, there was like another door that opened, you know?
So tell me how much of his his personal collection that he showed you, or how much do you actually look through, and how did you decide what to show into your documentary?
I honestly looked at probably everything. Like every sketchbook he's ever had, there's a stack almost higher than him. They're like, he has this vault and they're in there. And then he gave me, maybe 2 years in, he gave me a hard drive of everything he's ever made digitally. And then I had photography from all of his galleries and from his studio system of everything he's ever painted. And I'm like a bit of a Geoff aficionado because I've known his career for 20 years. So I'm acting as an editor of like what works for the story, but then I also know like chronologically where these things are, what some of the best work, what are some kind of like misfire. So I'm like there to kind of like act as a conduit to kind of like tell that story from a chronological POV, and making sure that we're hitting the really heavy hitter projects that people kind of like are aware of, or the pieces of art that we're aware of.
Wow. And the animation sequences, was that his animation, or did you have to somehow develop the animation?
So it's a style that he's kind of worked out over the years, like this kind of like pencil test aesthetic, which is a way that Disney animators back in the day would test animations. Is they would use a pencil, sketch out every other frame, and it's basically like cell animation. So that's a style that he's developed. We kind of took a lot of his drawings. I did some quick tests and said like, hey man, we're basically mimicking the style you've done, but I'm using it for purposes of this film. Throughout the film, I wanted to be sure of not making it like his burden to tell his story in a film. So I made sure he was fine with that. I sent him some of these animations. I was like, we're kind of mimicking what you're doing with my team over here. Are you fine with this? And he said, yes. He gave us artistic license to do so. So we kind of like replicated his style, but within the context of the film. And he loved it, you know?
Well, I loved it too. I think that was a good. It helps with the pacing of your
Thank you.
documentary, and it shows something else differently.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And for you personally, because you're an aficionado of Geoff here, I want to know, what was the very first thing that you were introduced, and then you just loved Geoff. Do you recall?
Yeah, there's a book. There's a book of his that I saw. It was kind of a compilation book of maybe like 50 pages of like, hey, this guy's an interesting graphic designer who's starting to make art. I think it was called Gas Book. Or it was an early 2000s book. It was like a series of directors like Mike Mills, Geoff McFetridge, like a bunch of people of that era had these books. And I came across this, and my friend showed it to me, and my mind was really blown. Just how inventive it was, how humorous it was, how much humanity there was in it. It was like a discipline that I was practicing, which was graphic design, but he was taking it in a much more personal, artistic avenue, where graphic design was serving his needs as a creator rather than the graphic designer serving the needs of the client. And I think I was really drawn to that, and that progression that he was starting on at that moment in time, that became an artistic practice, but it was really using graphic design as art in the beginning of his career. So I was really drawn to that because it was so unique at the time. It was like graphic designer as author or as artist, which is not how you're trained as a graphic designer. Usually as a graphic designer, you're anonymous. Your name is not on it. You're servicing the client's needs. But he was using that process, but servicing his own needs, which was super rare at that time.
And Spike Jonze, I love that guy. That he is a terrific director. Did Geoff bring Spike into this, or you approached Geoff? You approached Spike.
I approached Spike. So we had interviewed him for the film. He's obviously a collaborator and a friend of Geoff's. There was a point where after the Spike interview, the same day I went back to Geoff's studio, and Spike had called Geoff, and they were talking on the phone, on speakerphone, and I was downstairs in Geoff's studio, and I heard them talking about the film. So I was like, oh, and he said very positive things about the line of questioning that we had. So I was like, okay, there's a little seed here. So I filed it in my brain. And I said, when we're ready, I'm going to take a shot and see if this guy's would be involved and wanted to be involved more. So when we got to that point where I had a pretty solid edit, I reached out to him again and said, would you consider being involved? I made sure Geoff was fine with it. I didn't want to burden Geoff with that because it's not just film. I didn't want to have him get his friend involved. I wanted to make sure it was on the merits of the film. I sent the film to him. We got on this hour-and-a-half call, and he gave me a lot of notes. And at the end of it, I said, do you want to be involved? And he didn't say yes or no. So I was like, oh, okay. Like that, what a blessing to have notes from Spike Jonze, right? And I was like, okay, that was fantastic. And then I called back the next morning and said, he's rethought about it and he wants to be involved. And like my mind was blown. And it's just like to have access to him and his brain. It was like over the course of a couple conversations. It wasn't like he was every day intimately involved, but there was these touch points along the way where I could show him a cut and get a really astute film perspective. And then also as someone who knows Geoff intimately for 20 years, he was like, you're showing him this way, but I think he's more of this way. And we just had a dialogue about it. And he gave me really great notes to maybe not deify Geoff as much, which we were doing a little bit more in the beginning, to really consider the arc and what story we're trying to tell across the arc. He was the one who pushed me to kind of really include a lot of those archival moments, which were shot on cell phone footage, which to me was like so aesthetically different, but I think really opens the film up emotionally. So there are a bunch of like very key decisions that he helped us unearth. It was like such a blessing to have him involved, and it was a truly positive experience that I'm just extremely blessed to have had.
Most excellent, and you did wonderfully with this film. So Dan, thank you very much for this conversation, and have fun at South by Southwest.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Gig.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it. Bye now.